The human diplomat stood in the midst of alien enforcers, his wrists bound by chains that bit into his skin. The cold, sterile environment around him seemed a far cry from the once thriving world he had fought so hard to protect. He had violated the sacred intergalactic treaty in a desperate attempt to save his people, but now he would pay the price. The alien forces, representing the dominant powers of the galaxy, had no room for error or mercy. The laws were absolute, and to defy them was to sign your death sentence. The diplomat's chest rose and fell with each controlled breath, his calm composure in stark contrast to the seething rage of his captors. As they dragged him through the sprawling alien city, the faces of his captors remained stoic, their eyes void of empathy. His mind, however, was elsewhere. He didn't see the alien architecture or the gleaming, cold stone beneath his feet. His thoughts were consumed by the treaty he had broken, the families he had failed, and the bitter reality that he had come too far to turn back. Yet even as the alien enforcers dragged him closer to the execution grounds, there was a strange peace that settled in his heart. Despite the severity of his offense, he remained resolute. The plan had been risky, perhaps reckless, but it was the only chance. He had known what the consequences would be, but his people needed a voice. As the crowd grew louder, his mind flashed back to his final moments with the leaders of Earth, who had sent him into this lion's den with no backup and no plan for escape. They had deemed the treaty essential, but he had known better. They had underestimated the galaxy's unforgiving nature, and now the weight of that mistake was on his shoulders. The enforcers stopped at the center of the massive execution arena, a place designed to put fear into the hearts of those who dared challenge the law. The crowd of alien spectators murmured amongst themselves, eager to witness the demise of a traitor. The diplomat was shoved to his knees, the cool metal of the execution block digging into his skin. His head was held high, eyes fixed forward, staring into the sea of alien faces that watched his every move. They thought he would beg for mercy. They thought he would tremble and cower before the enforcers. But he did none of these things. Instead, he stood tall. His body was broken, bruised, and bound, but his spirit was unyielding. The cold air carried no words from him, but his gaze spoke volumes. The alien enforcers looked on, some with disdain, others with a fleeting sense of curiosity. Was he truly this arrogant, or was there something else? They could not fathom it. Then, as the final blow was about to fall, something unexpected happened. A word, a phrase, slipped from the diplomat's lips. It wasn't a plea for mercy, nor a final act of defiance. It was something else entirely, words in a language long thought extinct. The enforcers froze. For a moment, the world seemed to slow. The sound of the crowd faded, the air thick with confusion. His words resonated in the arena like an ancient echo, vibrating through the cold stone walls. The enforcers didn't understand the language, but they felt its weight. The leader of the enforcers, a towering figure of authority, narrowed his eyes. He had spent years studying the languages of the galaxy, and yet he recognized nothing in the diplomat's speech. His mind raced, trying to place the words. But it wasn't the language itself that troubled him, it was the feeling behind it. Something about the phrase seemed important, no, more than important. It felt significant. The rest of the enforcers shared the same unease, the same uncertainty. They glanced at each other, unsure how to proceed. This wasn't just any human. This man carried something more than a simple sentence, or a plea for mercy. The air around him had changed. The tension in the arena thickened. The diplomat's lips parted slightly as he spoke again, his voice steady, though it carried an undertone of ancient knowledge, something lost to time. The enforcers were not prepared for this. Their strict training had never prepared them for the unexpected, the unknown. They were warriors, but this was something beyond their understanding. As the diplomat's words continued to flow, they realized it wasn't just his survival at stake anymore. It was the very fabric of the galaxy that could be unraveling before them. Suddenly, the leader of the enforcers took a step back. He had heard of this. The words were part of an ancient dialect, one connected to royal bloodlines long thought extinct. This was the language of the Forgotten Kingdom, once a powerful force in the galaxy, before it was destroyed in a civil war. But the true descendants of that bloodline had been lost to time, their legacy buried. The Enforcer's primary task was to maintain order, to prevent such legacies from resurfacing, yet here, in the flesh, was the very heir to that forgotten kingdom. The diplomat had unknowingly spoken the sacred words, words that could change everything. The realization hit the leader like a wave. This man was not just a traitor, he was the descendant of an ancient royal bloodline. His family had been erased from history, their names stricken from the annals of time. Yet now, here he was, standing before them, alive, and wielding the forgotten power of his ancestors. The Enforcers were no longer certain of their mission. The diplomat was no mere criminal. He was a key player in an ancient prophecy, one that foretold the return of the lost royal family, and the dawn of a new age in the galaxy. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. The Enforcers who had once seen him as a simple criminal now regarded him with a newfound fear and respect. To kill him would be to risk unleashing something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. Their mission was to restore order, but they had never anticipated that order would be disrupted by a single human. The leader's mind raced. Should they protect him? Or would they allow him to die and risk the consequences of defying prophecy? A shift had taken place in the Enforcers' ranks. They now understood the truth. The diplomat was far more than a symbol of defiance. He was the key to an ancient power, a power that could challenge their very existence. They couldn't afford to kill him, not yet. The fate of the galaxy was suddenly uncertain, and all eyes were on the diplomat, whose words had unwittingly set the stage for something far greater than his execution. He had just revealed something far beyond himself. He had revealed the future. And the Enforcers, once certain of their mission, now had to decide whether to protect him or to eliminate the threat he posed. The balance of power in the galaxy had just shifted. The diplomat's words hung in the air, a quiet ripple that spread throughout the crowd of alien Enforcers. The leader of the group stood motionless, his mind racing. The ancient language, long thought extinct, was not just a relic, it was a key to something far larger, something powerful. For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The Enforcers, hardened by years of strict obedience, now found themselves standing at the precipice of an unknown reality. This human wasn't merely a prisoner, he was a symbol, a living connection to an ancient prophecy. The crowd murmured in confusion, their excitement at witnessing the execution quickly fading. The leader turned to his officers, his hand subtly raised, signaling for silence. The usual ruthless efficiency of the Enforcers was gone. This was no longer about a traitor to be executed. It was about something much more profound, something beyond their comprehension. The diplomat's royal bloodline, long buried in history, was no mere myth. His words had unlocked something in the very fabric of their existence. The consequences of this discovery were massive, and the Enforcers were unsure how to handle it. With the leader's command, the Enforcers hesitated, their weapons now lowered. The leader's gaze remained fixed on the diplomat, who had fallen eerily quiet after his outburst. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the city's machinery. Every member of the group was gripped by the gravity of the situation. In that instant, they were no longer warriors enforcing the law, they were witnesses to something that could alter the course of galactic history. The diplomat's mind raced as well. He had spoken those words instinctively, knowing only that they had a meaning beyond the surface. What he didn't know was how or why they had come to him. It had felt as if a switch had flipped inside him, a dormant part of his identity awakening from centuries of dormancy. The weight of that revelation settled heavily on his shoulders. The prophecy was real, and he, the very man they were about to execute, was at the center of it. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The Enforcers, now uneasy, were questioning their mission. The leader's voice finally broke the silence. It was steady but laden with authority. He spoke words that sent ripples through the diplomat's mind, a realization dawning on both of them. The diplomat was the descendant of a lost royal bloodline, a legacy that had been deliberately erased. This discovery had been hidden for eons, yet here it was, in front of them. The Enforcers had no protocol for this, no contingency plan. Their mission had been clear: eliminate the traitor. But now, with the words spoken, they had inadvertently uncovered something far more dangerous. The leader's gaze softened for a brief moment, the cold, calculated expression replaced by something almost human: uncertainty. He had heard of the ancient kingdom that once ruled vast swathes of the galaxy, but it had been destroyed in a civil war centuries ago. The bloodline had been thought extinct. Now, a descendant of that royal line stood before him, alive, and the galaxy would never be the same again. His words had triggered something, a power that had been dormant for too long. The enforcers, sensing their leader's hesitation, exchanged glances. The tension in the air was palpable. It was no longer just about carrying out an execution. It was about safeguarding a piece of galactic history that could alter everything. If they killed him, they would risk awakening forces they couldn't control. The diplomat, though a prisoner now, could be their greatest ally, or their most dangerous enemy. The leader's voice grew firmer as he spoke again, addressing his officers. He had made his decision. The diplomat would not die, not today. The enforcers were ordered to take him into custody, but this time, the gravity of the situation weighed on their every move. They were no longer just soldiers. They were protectors of an ancient secret that could reshape the galaxy's balance of power. The diplomat, still reeling from the realization of his own identity, was led away in silence. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his composure. He knew now that his role in the galaxy was far more significant than he had ever imagined. He was no longer just a diplomat representing Earth. He was a key player in a galactic struggle that had been unfolding long before he was born. As the enforcers escorted him through the city, the diplomat's thoughts turned inward. His life, once filled with political negotiations and diplomatic missions, had now been upended by a single phrase. He had become a symbol, not of a human world, but of an ancient galactic empire, one that had been lost to time. His survival, and the potential return of that empire, could mean the end of the fragile peace the galaxy had fought to maintain. The enforcers kept their distance, watching the diplomat closely. They had no idea how to handle someone like him, someone who now carried the weight of a prophecy they had never even known existed. They were used to handling traitors, criminals, and rebels, but this was different. The diplomat's bloodline had been erased from history, his people silenced in the wake of a brutal war. Yet here he was, alive, a living testament to an age-old legacy. The leader of the enforcers, still grappling with the implications of what had just occurred, began to speak to his officers in quiet tones. His orders now shifted, the plan to execute the diplomat now a thing of the past. They would have to protect him, at least for the time being, until they could fully understand the ramifications of his presence. This was no longer a simple case of law enforcement. It was a matter of political survival for the entire galaxy. The enforcers moved cautiously, their steps deliberate. They had to move quickly, as they knew that the powers that be would soon want answers. The diplomat's words had triggered a chain of events that couldn't be undone. Whatever his fate was, it was no longer in their hands alone. The galaxy, and all its ancient secrets, were now within reach. And the enforcers had to decide how they would navigate this new reality. The diplomat, though a prisoner, had just become the most valuable, and dangerous, individual in the galaxy. The diplomat's words had changed everything, and now, every passing moment felt like a countdown to an unknown future. The enforcers walked in formation, but their usual confidence was gone. They were no longer just soldiers. They were guardians of a secret that could alter the fabric of the galaxy. The leader walked in front, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. His mind replayed the moment the diplomat spoke, and it gnawed at him. The phrase in the ancient language was no accident. It was deliberate. But what did it mean? He turned to his officers, all of whom were still visibly unsettled. Their mission had been simple: capture the diplomat, execute him as a message to other human renegades. But now, that mission had fractured. The diplomat had spoken a language that had not been heard for centuries, a language tied to a lost royal bloodline that was thought to be nothing more than myth. Yet it was real. And that meant that the diplomat, this seemingly insignificant human, held a power that could not be ignored. We must move him to the central holding facility, the leader said, his voice firm but laced with uncertainty. The High Council will need to decide what to do next. The High Council was the galaxy's most powerful ruling body, and their decision would determine the fate of the diplomat, and possibly the entire human race. The enforcers nodded in silence, the weight of the situation hanging over them. The leader could sense their unease. They were trained for combat, for interrogation, for following orders without question. But this was different. This was history in the making. And the diplomat, with a single phrase, had turned the tide in his favor. As they approached the holding facility, the leader found himself questioning everything he had been taught. The diplomat wasn't just a prisoner. He was the key to something far larger than any one individual. His royal bloodline, though buried and erased, had survived in the shadows. And now, it was awakening. What would happen if others, more powerful than the enforcers, learned of this? Would the galaxy plunge into war? Would old alliances fracture, and new ones rise? The leader's thoughts were interrupted as the diplomat spoke again. His voice, calm and composed, broke the tension in the air. "You don't understand what you've unleashed," he said, his words heavy with implication. "You've just triggered something far beyond your comprehension. It's not just about me anymore. It's about the galaxy's future." The leader's gaze hardened. The diplomat was a prisoner, but his words carried the weight of a prophecy. The enforcers had been part of an empire that had crushed the ancient bloodlines of the galaxy, but they had underestimated the resilience of those they thought vanquished. The diplomat wasn't just a political figure. He was a herald of change. His existence, hidden away for centuries, was now a threat to the established order. The leader couldn't ignore that. "Be careful with your words, human," the leader warned, his voice laced with warning. "The High Council will decide your fate soon enough. Until then, you are to remain silent." But the diplomat didn't seem to care. "You're not in control anymore," he said, his voice calm but with a knowing undertone. "The prophecy is unfolding, whether you like it or not." The leader clenched his fists. The diplomat's arrogance was maddening. But there was truth in his words. The prophecy was real, and the enforcers had unwittingly placed themselves in the middle of it. Now they were bound by forces they didn't understand. And there was no turning back. As they reached the facility, the leader hesitated. He had ordered the diplomat's execution once, but now everything had changed. The diplomat's survival was no longer a matter of justice. It was a matter of cosmic balance. The enforcers were caught in a web of fate they could not escape, and they had to choose their next move carefully. They had no idea how powerful the forces they had just set in motion were. The diplomat was no longer just a symbol of human defiance, he was a figure of destiny. The leader's mind raced as he led the diplomat into the holding area. What would the High Council decide? What would the galaxy's leaders do with this newfound knowledge? The diplomat's bloodline had been erased, but it was still alive. And the words spoken, those ancient words, were a signal. A call to arms. The dormant empire had awakened, and the galaxy would never be the same again. But the enforcers were caught between two worlds. They had their orders, and those orders had been clear: eliminate the threat. But now, that threat was no longer just a threat to their empire. It was a threat to the entire galaxy's power structures. The High Council would not take kindly to a living heir to a bloodline they had sought to destroy. The diplomat was not just a prisoner, he was the linchpin in a galactic power struggle. As the enforcers secured him in his cell, the leader remained in the shadows, watching the diplomat closely. The human had done more than speak a forgotten language, he had revealed the truth. The galaxy's history was not what it seemed, and the diplomat was the key to unlocking that truth. The enforcers were no longer just enforcers of the law, they were now protectors of a secret that could topple the galactic order. And as the leader turned to leave, he knew that the galaxy's fate was now in motion. The diplomat's survival was just the beginning of a much larger conflict. For the first time, the leader questioned whether they were on the right side of history. But the decision had been made, and there was no going back. The diplomat was alive. And in that moment, everything had changed. The air was thick with tension as the diplomat sat in his cell, his mind running over the events that had brought him here. His capture had been swift, and the enforcers had been determined to end his life without hesitation. Yet now, after speaking those ancient words, everything had shifted. He wasn't sure whether he was a prisoner or a pawn in a game much larger than he had anticipated. The prophecy had been awakened, and he was its reluctant centerpiece. The leader of the enforcers had been clear. His survival was no longer a simple matter of fate. There were forces at work now, forces beyond the control of either the diplomat or the enforcers. The diplomat had unwittingly triggered the resurrection of a long-lost empire, and that had made him both a symbol of hope and a target. Every moment since his capture had been a countdown. What would the High Council do with him? What would the galaxy's leaders decide when they learned of his bloodline? In the quiet of his cell, the diplomat couldn't help but feel the weight of his lineage pressing down on him. His father's name had been erased from the records, and the royal bloodline buried in the rubble of a war that had ravaged the galaxy. Yet, somehow, his existence had survived, hidden away until now. The words he had spoken had sparked something, a dormant power that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. But now that it had been unleashed, what would come of it? His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps approaching. He stood quickly, instinctively aware that things were about to escalate. The High Council had been notified. They would decide his fate soon, and he would have to be ready for whatever came next. The door to his cell opened, and the leader of the enforcers stepped inside. The diplomat studied him carefully. There was something in the leader's eyes, something akin to fear. The enforcer had been trained to face death without flinching, yet now, he was uncertain. The diplomat's survival wasn't just a matter of politics anymore. It was personal. It was about more than just his royal bloodline. It was about what that bloodline represented. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," the leader said quietly, his tone almost reluctant. "The High Council has been informed. They will decide your fate, but they are not pleased. You've become far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated." The diplomat remained silent. His thoughts raced, but he knew that speaking too much would only give away his fear. The prophecy, the bloodline, the power that had been dormant for centuries, it was all too much for any one man to understand in such a short time. But there was no turning back now. The leader continued. "You are not just a human diplomat. You are a key to something ancient. I don't know what your role in all of this is, but the High Council will decide what to do with you. They'll either use you or destroy you." The diplomat's pulse quickened, but he kept his composure. "I don't care what they decide. I don't have a choice, do I?" The enforcer stared at him, his gaze hardening. "No, you don't. But neither do I. If the High Council chooses to protect you, you will be a symbol. You'll lead humanity into a war against powers far greater than you can imagine. If they choose to eliminate you, you will become a martyr. And the galaxy will change in ways no one can predict." The diplomat swallowed hard. The enforcer's words were blunt, but they were the truth. Whatever the outcome, it would shape the galaxy in ways they couldn't fathom. The enforcers had wanted to kill him. They had thought of him as a mere traitor. But now, they realized that he was more than just a prisoner. He was a pivot point in a much larger scheme. "You don't understand," the diplomat said after a long pause, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "This isn't about me. It's about the galaxy's future. What I've triggered, what I've uncovered, it's bigger than all of us. You have no idea what will happen once they learn of this. I don't even know what's going to happen. But I can tell you this, if I die, something worse will come." The leader's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing his features. He had been trained to view everything with a cold, pragmatic mindset. But now, faced with the reality of what the diplomat had just said, his confidence faltered. The diplomat wasn't just an inconvenience or a threat to be eliminated. He was part of something much larger, something beyond their understanding. And now that the prophecy had been set in motion, there was no turning back. "Then what do we do?" the leader asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The diplomat looked at him, his eyes filled with a sense of grim determination. We wait for the High Council to decide. But know this, the moment they make their move, everything will change. It won't just be the humans who suffer. Everyone will. The enforcer nodded slowly, his expression grim. He had no choice now but to follow through with his orders. But the uncertainty gnawed at him. The diplomat had become more than just a political pawn, he was a harbinger of something much darker. And the enforcers were caught in the middle. As the leader turned to leave, the diplomat's voice stopped him. You don't have to do this. You don't have to follow their orders. There's still a chance for all of us. The leader hesitated, then gave a single, curt nod. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: the diplomat had just become the most dangerous man in the galaxy. And no matter what happened next, the consequences of this moment would echo through the ages. The door slammed shut behind the enforcer, and the diplomat was left alone with his thoughts. His survival had become the galaxy's most dangerous gamble. And now, the game had truly begun.